Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our programs are free and open to the public and are at noon on most Sundays. We're at 4700 Grover Avenue. We welcome your attendance. If you want more information about our programs, you can go to our website at www.austinuu.org. And now Dale Beulah is going to introduce today's forum speaker. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Public Affairs Forum. It's my pleasure to introduce Andy Sansom. He's kind of Mr. Conservation in Texas, I think. Dr. Sansom is one of Texas' leading conservationists and former director of Texas Parks and Wildlife, as well as executive director of the Nature Conservancy of Texas. Under his leadership at Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, he spearheaded a number of significant programs, and I'm going to mention just 4 of them. He was responsible for the founding of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. He added over 500,000 acres to our state park system, as well as wildlife management. That's a pretty good accomplishment, I would say, in a state that really hangs on to its dollars. He was responsible for creating 2 nationally recognized aquatic facilities, which include hatcheries, research laboratories, educational centers, and aquariums. And 4th, he was involved in initiating an aggressive program to introduce urban children to nature and the outdoors, which is critical for our future, I think. He has dedicated his life to the environmental conservation effort. He now serves as executive director of the Meadows Center for Water and Environment, where he is the coordinating university policy fellow and researcher relating to freshwater resources. He's in charge of managing the headwaters of the San Marcos River, which is the 2nd largest artesian spring in the United States, western United States. He has a whole list of credentials, but I want him to talk rather than me. So, Andy, come up and tell us how to deal with our Texas drought and what things we can do to help with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale, and thank all of you for having me today. I've got many friends here, and I'm very glad to see you. It's an honor for me to participate in this activity, which has been going on for so long. It's the largest public policy forum in the state and has contributed significantly over the years to the life and times of our community. Dale, I appreciate that introduction. I've known Dale for quite a while, and I didn't realize that he possessed the principal attributes of the politician, which are that he was able in that introduction to make things sound better than they actually are. Which always reminds me of a man that was trying to get some insurance for his family. And he was filling out the forms, and he got to the part where he had to say what has happened to his parents. And the problem was that his father had been hanged. And so he was reluctant, to put that down explicitly. And so in order to make things sound better than they actually were, he wrote on the form that his father had died at the age of 69 while participating in a public ceremony when the platform collapsed. So, thank you for the introduction. It's appropriate today that we're in an institution like this because we should all be praying for rain. We're in a world of hurt, and I guess if I had any real message for you this morning, it is that this is a big deal. This is not something that is minor in our life and times. It's a global issue. Every 20 seconds across the world, a child dies because of lack of water or poor water quality. There are more children dying in the world every day from problems related to water than are killed in all the wars that are going on in the world today. Across the world, the average woman walks 9 miles every day to get water for her family across the world. And so while we are in the midst of what may be the most extreme drought that we've experienced, certainly in our lifetimes. We are sharing with the people across the world a global issue, which in many places is a far greater crisis than it is here in Texas. Our population in Texas is going to double in the next 50 years. We're going to have twice as many people in the state in the next 50 years, and yet we have already given permission for more water to be withdrawn from most of our rivers than is actually in them today. So that, and yesterday I traveled down near the coast and crossed the Colorado at Columbus and LaGrange and Smithville and Wharton, down lower on the coast, and I've never seen it like that. And the problem is, if all of the water rights on rivers like the Colorado were actually exercised, it would be completely dry. And that's true of many of our rivers in the state. We typically think of the drought of the 1950s as a drought of record, meaning it's as bad as it's going to get. And all of our planning, all of our water policy is based on the presumption that the 1950s is as bad as it's going to be. And it was bad. Dave McNeely and I can remember an older gentleman who was the chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee for many years named Bill Sims. And Sims was from San Angelo, and he was very conservative. And he grew up with a man who I'm sure all of you recognize, at least by name, Elmer Kelton. Elmer Kelton's one of the most famous Texas authors. In fact, Elmer Kelton was named the #1 Western author in the United States. Well, the best book that I can recommend to you to read about the drought of the 50s was Kelton's book called The Time It Never Rained. It's a beautiful novel about a rancher in that area who experienced the drought of the 1950s. Well, I knew that Sims and Kelton were contemporaries, that they'd grown up together and known each other all their lives. And so in order to kind of make conversation with Senator Sims, whom I didn't have a whole lot in common with, I said, "Have you read The Time It Never Rained?" And he said, I can't read it because it brings back such painful memories for me that I simply can't read it, even though Elmer Kelton was one of his best friends. So it was bad. There's a couple of very significant differences, however, to think about in terms of the drought of 50s and what we're experiencing today. Number one, in the 1950s, everybody in Texas lived in small towns, or they lived on a farm or a ranch, or they had a parent or an aunt or a brother or a sister who was involved directly in agriculture, or they worked in a feed store or a tractor business or something related to agriculture. So in the 1950s, everybody understood what was going on. Today, we were at that in the 1950s, 85% or more rural in nature. Today, we're at least that urban. There's more state representatives and senators from the Houston-Galveston area than there are from the entire state west of I-35. So the population has fundamentally changed since the 1950s, such that when our children go into the bathroom and flush the toilet or go in this kitchen and turn on the sink and water comes out, they think everything's okay. And so we have a significant difference in the perception of drought in our population simply because of where we live and how we're growing up. The second major difference is that we probably have, just take the near hill country, from sort of Williamson County across the Highland Lakes down to Hays County, Blanco, and back in toward Comal County, there's probably 400,000 wells just in that region alone, which didn't exist in the 1950s. And so the magnitude of the experience that we're having right now is multiplied simply because we are making unbelievable demands on our groundwater that frankly didn't even exist in the 1950s. Here is a chart showing how bad it got in the 1950s, and we got there in 2011. The only difference so far is duration. We clearly could equal the impact on our state of the drought of the 1950s if this condition goes on. And I'm sure, like most of you, like me, I watch weather reports now more than I ever have in my life, but I've never found them to be less accurate. We simply don't know what is about to happen. Well, give me an example. Last week they said we were going to get a bunch of rain out of this tropical storm. So we simply do not have the ability to predict the weather, I think, given what the changes that are clearly taking place in the climate that we've had in years past. And this situation, I think the most important thing about water planning going forward, and the state has finally begun to acknowledge it, is that we can't simply depend on the fact that this drought is not going to be far worse than it was in the 50s. Let's hope that will break. And what we say in San Marcos to people who come to see us is, you're as welcome as the rain, which is about as nice a thing as you can say to a person. But it may not. It may go on for a long time. There's been droughts. The fossil record indicates that we've experienced droughts in this region that may have lasted hundreds of years. And so we really can't. I'm an optimist. People ask me sometimes, well, how in the world with all those statistics can you be optimistic? And I say, well, first time somebody asked me that, I said, well, it's my way. But being an optimist, we still cannot assume that this is not going to be far worse. And so we have to base our planning on the worst case scenario. In 2011, we lost 2,500 homes in Texas, 1,600 of which were in Bastrop County from fire. The biggest hits have been in agriculture. We probably have about an $8 billion annual loss in agriculture today, and that's about 115,000 jobs. So it's hitting agriculture particularly hard. As of June, you can see the darkest areas are what we call exceptional drought. That's the worst. Right now, it's terrible down along the King Ranch, Kennedy Ranch, just downriver from Big Bend and up in the Panhandle. But basically, what this map tells you is that virtually the whole state, except along the Sabine River, is in some condition of drought. And as I say, the biggest hits have been in the agricultural sector. So what can we do? Okay, first of all, let me say to you that you should vote favorably for Proposition 6 in November. And I don't want anything that I have to say today to lead you to conclude that I don't think it's important that we pass that measure, because it is. And the legislature, as all of you know, because I know you follow public affairs, came together and established a proposal to go on the ballot in November to set up a $2 billion loan fund for water infrastructure. It's important, and there were some major gains made in that legislation, some of which were the result of work by people in this room. Number one, 20% of the money in that fund must be spent on conservation, on water conservation. That's huge. That's the only earmark in the fund, and it's very, very significant. Secondly, the legislation required that the Water Development Board, which administers water loan funds, be restructured and set up a system of setting priorities for which projects ought to receive funding. And we've never done that before. And it's going to be rough, because somebody's got to decide whether the money goes to Katy or Conroe or Johnson City or Fredericksburg. And so that's not going to be easy, but it's an important part of the measure, because right now it's 400 or 500 projects that are just thrown up on the wall. And there's not a distinction between which of these are the most cost-effective and which will serve the locations which are the neediest. Finally, it would be irresponsible to say that we don't need additional water infrastructure. Some of those projects will be controversial. Some of them, I think, are probably not useful at all. But to say that we should not be spending money on water infrastructure is irresponsible. And so I want to make sure that you understand that I'm for Proposition 6. But equally important for me, you can't build our way out of this. And I'm afraid that the message that we must make sure that our people understand going forward is that this is not an issue where we can just spend a number of billions of dollars building things and expect it to go away. And one of the reasons why that's in our culture is because that's what we did after the 1950s. And we did it very well. We built over 215 major reservoirs across the state after the drought of the 1950s. We went on a binge. And they served us well. It's probably the most extensive series of water reservoirs perhaps anywhere in the world. But we had a Senate Majority Leader who became President of the United States. We had a Speaker of the House. We had a Chairman of the Agriculture Committee, a Chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And so we were able to gain the benefit of immense concentrated power by Texans in Washington to put billions of dollars into that infrastructure program. And so we don't have anything like that kind of condition in Washington, D.C. today. First of all of our watersheds, Texas is entirely owned by private citizens, virtually. Does anyone know why that is? We came into the United States as an independent nation, unlike all of the other Western states. And so by doing so, we retained our public lands by negotiation, as compared to Colorado, Oregon, Nevada, all of whom basically their public lands became U.S. property. We kept it. And then for the first 70 years of our existence, we sold it to finance the government. We built the Capitol by giving 3 million acres to a British syndicate to build a Capitol. We established among the largest university endowments in the world in the University of Texas and A&M systems by using public land. And the source of the wealth of those two institutions today is still that. So by the 1920s or so, we had sold it all off, such that today about 95% of all of the land in Texas is owned by private citizens. And that includes the roads and the schools and the government buildings and everything else. And by the way, lest you misunderstand that I am not an advocate for private citizens, the landscape in Texas is better today than it was in 1890. We tend to think of environmental destruction as a function of modern life. But the fact is, if you look at accounts, biological accounts of the state of Texas from 1885 to 1905, all of the timber in East Texas had been cut. Most of the state had been overgrazed, such that the hill country lost 15 inches of soil, went from a lush grassland savanna to a cedar break in 30 years. And by the time Lyndon Johnson came into power, the hill country of Texas, unimaginable today, was the poorest place in the United States, along with Appalachia. So private landowners over the last 120 years or so have done a remarkable job in managing the landscape. The government has helped. Soil Conservation Service, the Parks and Wildlife Department have helped. But landowners in Texas understand that good stewardship makes good economics. And so it's important to understand that our private landowners have generally done a good deed for the rest of us. The problem is we are losing rural and agricultural land faster than any other state. The biggest terrestrial environmental problem that we have, and it relates directly to the water problem, is the continued breakup of family land. Every time someone dies in a family, every time the property taxes go up, the suburbs move out, the land is sold, kids can't agree on what to do with it, it gets divided up and comes to some adverse use. We are losing rural and agricultural land faster than any other state. And all of our watersheds, all of our recharge areas, all of the things that make the hydrologic system work, as David Bamberg can tell you, happen on private property. Our counties don't have ordinance-making authority. We're a culture that's resistant to regulation. And so we got to make sure as we move forward that we provide incentives for people to stay on private property and to do the right thing. Those of you who know me, and as Dale said, when I go to when they spread my ashes somewhere, I hope that there's some ashes of a deed in there to another public park or wildlife management area or refuge. Will be to the end of my lifetime an advocate for the acquisition of public land for our people to use. But if the state legislature, in some spasm of environmental consciousness, gave the Parks and Wildlife Department the entire state budget for a year to buy land with, I mean the whole thing, it would only change the amount of land in public ownership by maybe 1%. And so we've got to keep families on the land and help them do the right thing. And that means, for example, we need to spend some of that money buying people's development rights so that they stay on the land, they manage it, but they can afford to do that. There has been more money spent in Travis County, Hayes County, and Bexar County buying the development rights from private citizens for the purpose of protecting Barton Springs, protecting the Edwards Aquifer, than in the entire state and federal government combined have spent over the last 15 to 20 years in those three counties. And yet the state, which has a program for the purchase of development rights, has not spent a dime. And so we've got to find ways to keep private landowners on their land. It's not just a water quantity issue, it's a water quality issue. When I was growing up along the Texas coast, the issue was the discharges from the chemical plants and the municipal wastewater treatment systems. Today, those point sources of pollution we have regulated. So we know what's coming out of those pipes, and it is regulated. The biggest problem we have in water quality is runoff from roads and parking lots and agricultural fields and what we call non-point source pollution. And that, too, will be addressed by making sure that stewardship is encouraged on private property. In spite of what I said with respect to Proposition 6, we waste too much water. The cities of San Antonio and El Paso have lowered their consumption of water by 40% per capita. San Antonio has grown by over 1 million citizens in the last decade or so, and yet its overall consumption of water has not increased. We have metropolitan areas in Texas today where the consumption of water per capita is still increasing. And that's unconscionable, given the situation that we're facing. And it's not rocket science. The average community in Texas loses 25 to 30% of its water just between the water tower and your house because the water mains are not maintained properly or the distribution systems are aging. There are communities within 30 miles of here that lose up to 50% of all the water in their systems just because they haven't taken care of their water mains. Now, don't go away from here believing that's an easy one. In Dallas, which is one of those places that's still, in my mind, using more water than they need to be, if you took the water mains of Dallas and you put them end to end, it would stretch from Key West to Anchorage. So we're not talking about something that's going to be easy to do, but there's a tremendous amount of water in the system. And the easiest and cheapest water for us to get is the water we already have. That is probably the most important issue for us going forward. Environmental flows. Here's what I mean by environmental flows. That's the amount of water that's flowing in the Colorado between the Longhorn Dam and Bastrop. That's an in-stream flow. And it is the amount of water necessary to support the ecosystem in that stretch of the river. The second type of environmental flow is called a freshwater inflow. And that's the amount of water that's flowing from San Antonio Bay, flowing down the Colorado into Matagorda Bay to protect the ecosystems of those bays. We have the finest system of bays and estuaries of any state. and yet they're entirely dependent on continued flows of fresh water into those bays and estuaries. And quite honestly, we're doing a real poor job of protecting them. We went through a process in the early part of the last decade that took 2 legislative sessions to pass a bill in Senate Bill 3, which provided us for the first time a way for stakeholders in every river basin and scientists appointed within those basins to come together and make recommendations to the state as to what the environmental flow standards in those basins should be. We've gone through 6 river basins since the passage of that bill, and in no case has the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality adopted standards even close to what those local groups of citizens and scientists have recommended. So we're doing a really poor job. This is not just an environmental issue. It's a business issue. Everyone, I'm sure, is aware that there's a major case before the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans right now which contends that the state of Texas has so poorly administered the environmental flows in the Guadalupe that it is endangering the habitat of the whooping crane. The district judge in Corpus ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The case has been appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and who knows what's going to happen. But here's the takeaway. If you like whooping cranes, you're going to love mussels. Right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking at a series of mussels as being the next listed endangered species. And we have mussels in every single freshwater river in our state. And so we face a situation where if we don't get a handle and begin to get serious about protecting these flows, we're going to be fighting with the federal government in every river basin where endangered species are present. And irrespective of sort of where you are on an issue like that, it's a recipe for a whole lot of paralysis and anger at the very minimum. Here's the third one. Think about with me the Blanco. The Blanco starts out in Kendall County, just south of Fredericksburg, just below the Gillespie County line. It flows southeastward toward Hays County, where I work. And before it gets to Hays County, it goes back into the aquifer. Virtually all the flow of the Blanco goes right back into the ground through the riverbed. It flows underground to a lovely spring called Jacob's Well, which many of you have visited. Today it's not flowing. Comes up out of the ground in normal times at Jacob's Well, flows down Cypress Creek through the village of Wimberley, and back into the Blanco. If you tried to get a water right permit from the state today to take any significant amount of water out of the Blanco, it would be denied because it's already overcommitted. There's no more surface water to be granted in the Blanco. But if you want to go up above Jacob's Well and drill a well in the ground, you can drill and pump just about as much water as you're man or woman enough to pump without any regulation. We treat surface and groundwater in Texas as if there were different substances. We have given rights to the waters of our surface, of rivers and streams, to institutions and people since we were a colony of Spain. And yet we've also told private landowners who live upstream above our aquifers that the same water is theirs. And so the state has now put us in a position where it has told two different interests that the same water belongs to them. And that is, if you have kids that ask you what they should do when they get out of school, you should tell them to become water lawyers, because there's going to be a whole bunch of litigation on that issue. And it won't be between private citizens and the government. It's going to be people downstream who say, I've had this water for 100 years, against people upstream who are saying, I want to pump it and sell it to San Antonio or to Austin or to Buda or Hays County. Now, I'm going to put a qualifier on that. Private landowners have a bitch in this. Let's take a family who may have been living on a piece of ancestral property for 5 generations, and there's a spring. And they've been dependent on that spring for their livelihoods, for their agriculture, for their aesthetic needs. And all of a sudden, because of the actions of a neighbor or some groundwater management district that's not doing its job, their spring goes away. I believe those people have a claim. So I don't want to there are people who will tell you that we, like Colorado, as an example, should manage them the same. That if you want a permit to take it out of the ground, you go to the same people you ask for a permit to take it out of the river. I don't think we can do that in Texas. And once again, it's because of our unique geography of private ownership and because of our culture of respecting the rights of private landowners. But we've got to bring them closer together. We have to manage them conjunctively. Otherwise, it won't matter whether we spend $100 billion building stuff. I've talked a little bit about the water plan. The whole principle of this Proposition 6 is based on the Texas Water Plan. And I have every hope that what may happen as a result of this reprioritization that is required of the Water Development Board, that they will begin to incorporate some of these important policy issues into the process, as opposed to just creating every 5 years a wish list of infrastructure, which has basically been what it's been. I think that one of the potentially ugly aspects of this immediate few years that we're going to go through is that we face the very real possibility that we're going to have some winners and losers. Think about the debate that has been going on in the newspapers here for 2 years, where LCRA has basically cut off water to the rice farmers. The rice farmers have been doing it for 100 years. There's economies down there are dependent on rice farming. I spent yesterday morning in the opening day of teal season in a rice field with my Labrador Retriever. So for me, that whole culture down there is up close and personal. And yet at the same time, it's hard to argue today that the economic impact in Central Texas is not far greater in the overall picture than that of the rice fields. The data that I saw in the paper recently that really caused me to be shocked was that rice farmers use more in 1 year than we do in Austin in 15 years for lawn irrigation. So, it seems to me that it's easy to say, well, what's more important to society, watering St. Augustine or planting rice? That's an easy one. Until you get to the point where you see that the volume of water that it takes to grow rice is just immense. What we've got to try to avoid is hurting people and interests along the way. We're not the state we were in the 1950s, and we can't go back. But we've got a situation in which, if we're not careful, we're going to be governed by the rule that goes, big dogs eat first. And there's going to be a lot of people in rural areas along the coast that are going to be hurt unless we devise a system of getting people to work together to manage this transition. People often always ask me that, along with how in the hell can you be optimistic, the other question is, what can I do? I'm an attorney, I'm an accountant, I'm a school teacher, I'm a car dealer. What in the world can I do to help solve this problem? Every single one of us, no matter what we do in our lives, can find the time during the course of a year to take a kid fishing, or take a child and put them in Barton Springs, or take them down to San Marcos and put them on the glass-bottom boats, or take them to the coast and show them the incredible bays and estuaries. The most important thing that we can do for this coming generation, and something that every single one of us can do, is to take our children and put them in the water system and have them understand how magnificent it is and how fun it is. But it's also essential to every form of life, whether a plant or animal. And they've got to take responsibility for it if it's going to be there for their kids. So, thank you all very, very much. And I believe we're going to ask some questions.
And now we're going to have questions. Michael Leberkian.
Sir, you said you're an optimist. So how optimistic are you that science can help us squeeze water, let's say, out of the atmosphere? I mean, these clouds come by my house, nothing happens. Why can't our scientists devise some way? So where do you stand on the existence of scientific research on this?
Well, we're not spending enough on it. I would say that the answer to that question is that would be one of the things that I would invest in. There are places, it's interesting that you mentioned the clouds. There are places in the world where they have perfected a means of what's called fog harvesting, where you can, in fact, in areas of high concentration of evaporated water, you can condense it out and drink it. And so you're absolutely right, but I think that the argument that I would make is that we're not investing enough in science, and I believe that will be one of the ways that we can work our way out of this.
Jeanette Swenson, thank you. And I'd like to go back to your slide, the next to last slide, and you have winners and losers.
Right.
In these negotiations that are going to be happening, where are the compromise points? You know, everybody's going to have to give up something to gain something. So where do you see points of compromise?
I think the biggest one is probably going to be in becoming more efficient in our use of water, because we still have institutions in Texas that don't. I think that the understanding of the contribution that water conservation can make to this is much greater than it was a decade ago. But I can tell you that even in San Antonio, which has done so well, there are people who are absolutely adamant that they're going to continue to water their St. Augustine at all costs. And so we're going to have to understand that what our biggest room for compromise is to become more efficient in the metropolitan areas, and not take water away water away unnecessarily at the expense of people like farmers and ranchers.
We have a question here from Richard Halpin.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, sir, for a fabulous presentation. You really are a champion for our water. You mentioned that 25 to 50% of water is lost in distribution systems, and you also implied that we waste a lot of water at our homes, turning them on and off, and long showers and St. Augustine grass watering, etc. Since so much water is wasted in those two areas, and you've mentioned conservation half a dozen times, what's the game changer? How are we going to change that game? How are we going to invite more people to be conservative in their water usage? It seems like we've got to have a whole change of culture here in the state to do that. Thank you.
That's a very good point. If you go to Las Vegas, and by the way, if you want to know what we may be in for, go to Vegas. In Las Vegas, if you have a St. Augustine lawn, the city there's a market price per square foot for irrigated lawn. And I don't know what it is. Let's say it's $8.95 per foot. So if you call the city and say, I'll sell you 600 square feet of my lawn and not irrigate it, they'll pay you $8.95 a square foot for that. So there's a lot of stuff going on, particularly in the other Colorado River, that we can look to as guidance. But I will tell you that in those communities where conservation has become much more of a factor than it is elsewhere, the people know it. I mean, the people understand it. You don't have to argue about water conservation in El Paso or San Antonio or Las Vegas. So I think you're right that a lot of it's going to have to do with continued education, continued stressing of it's important to our citizens. But I will tell you that it's also a deal where the devil's in the details. There's going to be some big fights in the next few years over just exactly what is water conservation. If listen to the guys, men and women that run what's called the North Texas Water Utility District, which serves the areas up Denton, Sherman, Denison, McKinney. They will tell you that they have more water conservation projects in their plans than the entire rest of the state combined. And when I first heard that, I thought, man, well, what they call water conservation up there is, well, instead of taking water out of putting our wastewater back in the Trinity, we'll just keep it and not let it back in the river and keep using it. Well, listen, that's all well and good unless you live in Houston, and every drop of water that you take out of the Trinity has already been through the wastewater treatment plants of Dallas and Fort Worth. So there's some argument that's going to take place as to what exactly is meant by the term water conservation, because around the state we call it different things. Here's another fact for you. Everybody lives downstream from somebody else. Every drop of water that flows down the Rhine from the Alps to the North Sea goes through 11 people. Everybody lives downstream from somebody else. And so we've got to be real careful. There are some provocative reuse projects that make sense. San Antonio has 2 completely separate water distribution systems. You can buy water from the San Antonio water system that's potable and drinkable, and that costs X. Or you can buy partially treated water in a completely different system that costs less, but you can't drink it. You can use it for industrial cooling, you can use it for lawn irrigation or whatever. So there's no question but that reuse has a place. But we've got to remember that much of that water, for example, right now, all the water that's flowing from the Guadalupe River into San Antonio Bay for the whoopers is coming through the San Antonio wastewater treatment systems, most of it. So everybody lives downstream from somebody else.
Well, I'm curious. You know, I know San Antonio uses, I always forget what the acronym stands for. It's ASR. It's called water banking. But it stores the water underground so it will evaporate. How much is that their total way of saving water, or is that just one of their programs? And because the reason that interests me is because when you build reservoirs, number one, you lose half of it to evaporation, and then if it doesn't rain, you've got a big hole in the ground. So that interests me.
Once again, this is a wonderful group of people because of the knowledge, that is evident in your questions. And I'll try to work back through what you said because there's a lot of meat in that question. What the lady has asked about is a process called aquifer storage and retrieval, or recovery, ASR. You'll hear a lot about that. Any new reservoir built west of I-35, and there are some proposed in that water plan, would lose more in evaporation than it would contribute. So why do that? What aquifer storage and recovery does is that it captures excess flows and puts them into underground reservoirs where evaporation is not a factor. And San Antonio has a huge one down around Gonzales. And it's the biggest one in the state. It's not the only one planned, but it's the largest. Now, there's going to be some funky stuff in having to do with, remember I told you that the state has said that groundwater belongs to private citizens. And so what the San Antonio water system has had to do in order to protect itself is they've had to buy all the surface land above it in order to make sure that someone didn't come in and pump it out and say, well, no, it's my water. But aquifer storage and retrieval is one of the 2 new types of infrastructure that I think makes a whole lot of sense. Texas has dramatic differences in its aquifers across the state, so it won't work everywhere, but it certainly will work in the Edwards. The second point that your question begs for me is that you're going to hear a lot about desalination. You're going to hear particularly people in the engineering world say, well, this is easy. We'll just take water out of the Gulf of Mexico, desalt it, and then take it to market. The very first commercial desalination plant in the world was built in Freeport, Texas, turned on by John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office by flipping a switch. It was a total failure and kept alive for many years only because of the federal subsidies. But there are still people pushing it. And by the way, I'm not sure that sometime beyond my lifetime we will be desalinating Gulf of Mexico water. But the amount of energy that it takes to take the salt out of the water and then pump it 150 miles to San Antonio makes it completely unfeasible economically. And right now, unfortunately, we still view water as kind of as a right. And there's resistance to paying more for it. What I think will happen first, and it's pretty exciting, is the desalination of brackish groundwater. We have a vast amount of groundwater in Texas which is not potable because it is salty. But it's not anywhere near as salty as the Gulf, and it's near where the consumers are. And so San Antonio, El Paso has a wonderful brackish desalination plant which was built by Kay Hutchison at Fort Bliss. But it was a partnership with the city, and so the city gets the water from it as well. So brackish desalination and aquifer storage and recovery would be the two sort of frontier engineering solutions which I would say will offer a lot of promise.
We have a question here. Would you stand, please? Say your name.
Peter Durkin. How realistic is it to pump water from parts of the country to dry areas?
Another good question. It's not rocket science that in a state which has 60 inches of rainfall on its eastern border, where the economy is basically flat to declining, and 25 inches of rainfall along I-35, where the economy is booming, would continue to explore ways of moving water westward. And by the way, that's not a new idea. A lady came up to me at an event that I attended a while back, and she handed me a document which was a state water plan from 1930. They didn't even know about it at the Water Development Board. I took it over there, and they immediately put it online, and but anyway, it recommended moving water westward. Walter Prescott Webb, wrote a very famous book about moving water westward. I think we'll probably end up doing it. But like the groundwater deal, the new acronym for water is not in my backyard, but not out of my backyard. There was a group of investors that started about the time I went to Texas State, which was 2002, on a plan to move water from Toledo Bend, which is an immense reservoir in East Texas on the Sabine, in the Red, to the Metroplex. Their niche was, it was going to be Louisiana's portion of the reservoir. Well, wait. The beauty of that for them was they didn't have to go to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They just need to get permission in Louisiana. And so they got a bunch of very, very wealthy Texas investors, many of whom had major influence in Louisiana. They worked for a decade on the project. They went through every regulatory agency in the state, and Louisiana, was basically on its back because of Katrina and everything else, and so they agreed to do it. And at the last hurdle was to get the current governor of Louisiana, Mr. Jindal, to approve it, and he vetoed it. And he vetoed it because even though they got plenty of water, even though it was very lucrative to the state of Louisiana, the politics of giving away their water were more than he could stand. And so I think that's probably much a greater barrier, for example, than the environmental constraints or other issues. It's just that people don't like to say, well, why don't we send our water over to Dallas or San Antonio or whatever. But I think that there are cases where that would make sense. And I've spent a lifetime in the environmental movement, and I believe that there are ways to do it where it's environmentally responsible. But it's very difficult to get people to give up their water.
We're going to try to squeeze in a couple of questions. I'm sorry if we can't get to all of them. Jim Bryce.
Yes, excellent presentation. One footnote. Here in Austin, there have been programs that paid for removing the St. Augustine. They're not continual, but they've happened.
Right.
My question has to do with what I think we're sort of walking around just in your last mention, and that is this area of privatization, where there are movements for private sectors. I think Boone Pickens was involved in this, for not only the transport of water, but also the acquisition of all the water rights in the private sector, removing them effectively from the public commons. What are your observations and forecasts and ups and downs of the privatization issue?
Well, the two big battlefields for that today are, one, projects that would move groundwater from like Milam County, Caldwell, Bastrop, over to Buda and Kyle in San Marcos. That's one. The second one is a group of proposed projects that would move groundwater from out as far as like Brackettville and Uvalde and Medina in towards San Antonio. None of those projects have been approved at this time. San Antonio will probably hook up with one of those groups to try to do it. The first thing I would say is you still have the problem of people fighting the removal of water from their area. The Lost Pines Groundwater Management District, which is basically Bastrop and Caldwell, is fighting it tooth and nail. The more important thing I think, though, that I want to convey is I'm not opposed to having the private sector take up some of this burden. I believe that the projects that will be successful going forward may well be public-private partnerships. I do have an extreme aversion to projects that affect regions, affect communities that are not transparent. And so I would be strongly opposed to projects that would accomplish some of these major potential disruptions of life in our communities without a completely transparent process in which the public is involved.
Hi, Elizabeth Hinson. My question's about fracking. We have a water cycle, and water is supposed to go around in it and come back down to us. But it seems to me as though the fracking process removes millions of gallons from that cycle, contaminates them, and then buries them where it has the potential to contaminate aquifers. Could you comment on whether or not we have any chance of regulating that? Or I know there's some attempts to move to brackish water for use in that process.
Fracking is a subject that we don't want to go into today because we could be here all afternoon. I clearly would like you to hear from me that there are pluses and minuses. I mean, obviously, the fact that we're producing a lot more natural gas than before is a good thing. The impact on some of our communities, although extreme in some instances, is good. There's a lot of economic activity. On the other hand, there are problems with wastewater disposal. There are problems with transparency because we don't know what the chemicals are that they're being used in fracking. So it's a mixed issue and worthy of a complete discussion on its own. What I object to is that we still exempt agriculture and oil and gas from any regulation of the withdrawal of groundwater. We can't even find out how much water is being withdrawn. And that's wrong. We should, at the very minimum, understand every drop of water that's pulled out of the ground. And so the problem I have, and I hear some talk and I think you'll want to follow the interim charges between now and the session in 2015, because I think that's going to be a major topic, that we at least ought to know how much water people are pumping out of the ground, whether they're citizens or whether they're companies that are fracking.
Yes, thank you. My name is Brandy Clark-Burton, and I wanted to bring it home to the home level and talk about what your opinions are about rainwater catchment, the size of if we were to recommend a size for everybody to have, what would that be? And I've heard along the lines of the aquifer storage that just by contouring your land with, berms and swales and things like that, you can infiltrate a lot more water, which will be stored in our aquifer and used. And I'm wondering if, there's some sort of local campaign or, education about how we should be just contouring our land that would make a difference for our local water supply.
Well, I don't want to take advantage of him because he's sitting in the audience, but if you really want to have an answer to that question, you should go visit Sela Bamberger Ranch, because that is exactly what's happening there. And it's the gentleman who created it is here in the audience, and when I first met him, people thought he was crazy. And now you can go out there and you can see water flowing out of the ground because of changes in the landscape that he has made. And I believe that, thankfully, there are people now from all over the United States who are coming there to learn because of that.
Michael West.
Dr. Sansom, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Quick question, and I'll make it general. You can make it as specific as you'd like. There's an election season coming up this next spring. What are some of the issues we should look for from the people that will be looking for both the highest offices and the local offices throughout the state?
It seems like to me that an easy one would be to, in a state which is anti-regulation and very conservative, supportive of private property rights, that we ought to be able to get some money appropriated to buy the development rights from private landowners to keep them on the property. That doesn't seem to me to be particularly a far reach for our political leadership. And so that's where I'm going to be concentrating my time between now and the next session. Mostly.
Thank you. Thank you for a terrific talk.
Thank you.